Radioactive waste is back in the news after Cumbria voted to block a nuclear dump on the margins of Lakeland. It's a major setback for government, and it could also hinder plans to deal with a more pressing problem. Britain has accumulated the biggest stockpile of civil plutonium in the world, a target for terrorists and future bomb makers. What was once thought to be a valued asset is now a costly liability. The government faces a dilemma. Should it try to turn the stuff into nuclear fuel at huge cost, or write off the plutonium altogether? Previous attempts to deal with the problem went disastrously wrong, costing the taxpayer more than £1 billion. Tonight, File on 4 investigates what's been called one of the most embarrassing failures in British industrial history. And now MPs are worried taxpayers could be asked to pay up again.
If there's something I'm not understanding, I'd like to know. I'm waiting for this moment when somebody gives me the reason why we are wedded to this, because we're talking big figures.
Tonight's programme focuses on Britain's best known and most controversial nuclear plant at Sellafield in Cumbria. Well, just driving round here, it's clear it's a very big site indeed. On my right, I can see the distinctive dome of the early AGR, Advanced Gas-Cooled Reactor, from the early days of the nuclear programme. There's also the pile of Reactor 1, where the fire took place in the 1950s. There are waste ponds where fuel is cooling before it can be prepared for long-term disposal. So it is a huge industrial facility which almost embodies the entire history of the nuclear programme in Britain. I'm inside one of the most sensitive and highly protected buildings in Britain. It's a facility run by the National Nuclear Laboratories here at the Sellafield nuclear plant in Cumbria. Now, I can't describe the layers of security I've been escorted through to get here, the barriers, controls and protection systems, but suffice it to say, security is very tight. So why all this protection for what looks like a normal laboratory? Well, the answer lies behind these thick leaded glass windows. The scientists here are experimenting with minute quantities of a deadly radioactive material. It's in the form of a liquid solution, and it looks like vinegar. The material is plutonium, one of the most toxic materials ever created by humans. The scientists are handling it, shielded by the glass, using thick protective gloves, which extend into the glass box so they can work on the plutonium without ever touching it.
We go by the standard regulations when you are dealing with a hazardous material. You're keeping it in place. It's like having a tiger. You keep that in the place it's meant to be, not out here with the operators.
My guide in the lab is Eileen Turner.
He is actually holding a very small bottle with plutonium in solution in there. We deal with very small quantities in here. It's all for research purposes to see how plutonium behaves over a long time and in different conditions.
So all the security we've been through, all the precautions, all this concern over secrecy is about that little brown vinegar-like liquid in there.
Yes, it doesn't matter how small the quantity is, we still have these security precautions, yes.
The pulsing sound of the criticality detector tells us all is normal. No leaks, no cause for alarm. Well, everyone here is checked in and out for radiation levels, of course, and I've got to do the same. So I'm sweeping this handheld radiation monitor right close in to the body, down my arms and legs, and it is registering, so far, purely normal background levels of activity, which shows that despite having been in here for about half an hour, I've picked up absolutely nothing. Well, I've moved across this enormous sprawling site now with its alarms and radiation monitors to another facility, and this one we won't be allowed to see. It's a very modern building. It's grey, it's got stainless steel piping and tubing down the side and overhead gantries delivering material into it. This site is so sensitive that only a handful of specially cleared staff have ever seen what's inside it. The reason for the security is it houses not minute traces of plutonium like those we saw earlier, but tons of the deadly material. Britain has created the largest stockpile of separated civil plutonium in the world, 112 tons of the stuff no less, and most of it is kept just over there. Contrary to what you might expect, the plutonium is not kept in enormous barrels. It's actually kept in quite small containers made out of stainless steel and about a foot in length and probably about 5 inches in diameter. A bit like elongated biscuit barrels. Other than they are stainless steel and made to the highest specifications, and on the outside they actually have what amounts to a barcode, so the material can be traced should inspectors from abroad or at home need to identify which batch of plutonium came from where. All part of the checks and balances which go into keeping this stuff carefully monitored and accounted for. Stuart Latham is head of plutonium management facilities at Sellafield.
When we look to store plutonium, it's all about meeting the two twin requirements of safety and security. From a safety point of view, individual packages allow us to meet spacing requirements to keep it safe.
So if it wasn't broken down into these tiny batches which you can manage safely, there would be the risk of a chain reaction, a nuclear reaction?
Theoretically.
But because it's so portable, it's a potential terrorism target. One expert told us Britain's plutonium stockpile was enough to make 10,000 nuclear weapons. File on 4 has learnt that simply keeping the plutonium safe and secure for the coming century will cost us around £80 million a year. Adrian Simper is Director of Strategy and Technology for the Nuclear Decommissioning Authority, which now owns the site.
We are storing it safely and securely today, and believe we'll be able to do that into the future. That's an active management, constantly requiring expenditure of taxpayers' money, constantly managing the risk of having that material.
And the nightmare scenario that you're so concerned about will be what? Terrorism, nuclear bombs?
I think there's always the risk of terrorism. It's something we protect against all the time. We are very content, and our regulator is very content, that the material is safely guarded.
We've heard figures of around 80 million or even 100 million pounds a year just to look after the stuff. Are those reasonable figures?
Depends on how you count these things. We protect the Sellafield site, so we don't divide the numbers up that way, and the details are commercially sensitive. If you look in the policy position that government published, it has got the numbers. I think there are £8 billion for the storage and ultimate management of the material if we continue with the current policy.
So that would equate with about 80 million a year?
The sums seem to be like that, yes.
So how has such a costly problem developed? The truth is, plutonium is not an accidental byproduct. It was originally manufactured in nuclear reactors to make atomic bombs. It's now extracted from used nuclear fuel, basically radioactive waste, by what's called reprocessing. The pioneers of the atomic industry saw plutonium as a fuel for what was then a new style of reactor called the fast breeder. But it proved to be troublesome on both cost and safety grounds, and the government cancelled the programme in the early 1990s.
When civil reactor technology was being developed, people thought, wrongly as it turned out, that the world would be very short of uranium, which was the basic fuel.
Professor Gordon McCarran is the former chair of the government's Committee on Radioactive Waste Management.
They also knew from their work on making bombs that once you irradiated uranium fuel, it would create plutonium, and plutonium would be a very useful fuel in principle to fuel the so-called fast breeder reactor. And we therefore had to create the plutonium, separate the plutonium, and expect to use it as fuel for the fast reactor. For at least 30 years now, it's been very clear that the fast reactor was deeply uneconomic, as well as potentially have safety issues and lots of public acceptance issues because fueled by plutonium. And it's a non-starter and will be for the indefinite future. So given that we were already then beginning to create the plutonium at Sellafield, which we've done for 50 years now, so we've now spent quite a lot of time scratching our heads and wondering what to do with it, especially in relation to its potential harm as a bomb-making material.
The problem grew when British Nuclear Fuels, which ran the Sellafield site, realised it could make money by taking in more dangerous nuclear waste from abroad and separating out the plutonium. BNFL was paid handsomely for the job. The problem is none of the foreign owners, mainly Germany and Japan, have shown much practical interest in having it back. File on 4 has learnt that the amount of foreign plutonium in Britain has now reached 28 tonnes. That's about a quarter of the entire stockpile. The owners of the site may be struggling to find ways to use or get rid of it, but they're still producing it in large quantities. Well, the wind is really blasting in off the Irish Sea this morning, and we've come to the Thorpe reprocessing plant. It's a huge industrial complex. Standing alongside it, clad in brown as it is, it's a bit like being down at sea level alongside an enormous supertanker stretching away into the distance. It's a third of a mile long. Looking out over this futuristic industrial complex with its enormous yellow lifting cranes which straddle a pool of dark water, you could almost imagine it as the location for the dramatic climax of a James Bond movie. The water does contain used fuel from nuclear power stations, basically highly radioactive waste, and it's waiting to be reprocessed to retrieve the plutonium locked up inside it. So whilst one arm of the NDA is looking for ways to get rid of the bomb-usable material, the other is churning it out on a daily basis, 4 to 6 tonnes per year in fact, and it's all being added to the stockpile. The government wants to try and turn it into a fuel which can be used in nuclear power stations. The favoured option is to make what's called mixed oxide fuel, or MOX. It will involve building an expensive new factory to transform the plutonium into a usable form. For Professor Sir David King, the former science advisor to Tony Blair, MOX is the fuel of the future.
It is very clear that it is in the nation's interest to see that we deal with the plutonium stockpiles that we have. And in the nation's interest, the best route forward is to convert that into a fuel as mixed oxide, and then using that fuel in nuclear reactors that will be built once the mixed oxide is available. We need electricity. The advantage for the UK, let me say this, is massive. We end up generating all of our energy needs as we go into the future, or a large proportion of our energy needs, from fuel that is available in country. We're no longer dependent on imports. We wouldn't have to import another gram of uranium to continue down that route. It involves reprocessing and building a MOX plant.
But it has been tried before and it didn't work out well. Back in 1993, British Nuclear Fuels, then a state-owned commercial company which ran Sellafield, got approval to build a massive MOX fuel plant, not unlike the one that's proposed today. The new factory was supposed to start work in 1997 and cost £265 million. By 2001, the cost had reached £473 million. By then, the government had changed. Tony Blair was in power, and his Environment Minister, Michael Meacher, was having doubts on both environmental and economic grounds. He tried to block the scheme.
My opposition was overruled when I was at a conference in Europe, and I had a call from a very close personal assistant to Blair saying the Prime Minister wants a decision on this and he wants it this afternoon. And I said, well, I'm opposed. And he said, well, he wants it, so you better sign. So I was forced to sign. If I had resigned, which I could have done...
We do have to ask you why you didn't resign.
Well, I could have resigned on a point of principle. I think the detail behind this would have been totally unrecognised by the public, and it would have gone ahead anyway. It would have been an absolutely useless gesture. And I did have a sufficiently immodest view of what I was doing in environment to think that there was a lot else that I could contribute on the environmental front.
We approached Tony Blair's office for a comment, but there was no response. Michael Meacher had been outgunned by Downing Street. His warnings were ignored and the MOX plant began operating. But Victoria Bagjan, the UK editor of Platt's nuclear publications, says problems emerged almost immediately.
It started operation in 2001 and it was hoped that it would deal with some of the plutonium stocks in the UK by making them into MOX fuel to supply European customers, particularly in Switzerland and Germany. Now, the plant experienced problems from the very beginning, really. They didn't make their first fuel assembly until 2005, and they actually had to subcontract their first orders for a customer in Europe to their competitor.
That's pretty embarrassing.
I think it's interesting that they invited their competitors to come over and basically try and resolve some of the issues.
In 2004, Michael Meacher, who'd been sacked as a minister the year before, asked the National Audit Office to investigate what had happened at BNFL. File on 4 has now seen the response. It reveals that the cost of the MOX plant had risen again. Remedial work had been needed due to a complex plant design.
This remedial work contributed approximately half of the increase in estimated capital costs from the original £265 million to the latest figure of £490 million.
Closing the MOX facility was already being discussed, but there was no going back.
It would be more expensive to close the plant immediately than to continue operating.
But news of the failure spread. US diplomatic cables revealed by WikiLeaks quoted government officials saying the MOX plant was
one of the most embarrassing failures in British industrial history. The plant continues to drain resources and is a black mark for the entire industry.
In the end, events on the other side of the world forced the MOX plant to close.
A third explosion has been reported tonight at the Fukushima nuclear plant in Japan. One report suggests that radiation levels have increased at the site. Earlier, the authorities in Japan asked for international...
The Fukushima nuclear disaster in Japan nearly 2 years ago prompted a reappraisal of all nuclear activity there. They cancelled their contract with Britain to have Japanese plutonium, still sitting at Sellafield, turned into MOX fuel. Victoria Bagjan again.
It was only after Fukushima when they lost those Japanese contracts, so then the MOX plant was left really without new business. So I think that was perhaps the final nail in the coffin for the plant at Sellafield.
The business case for the plant, which was supposed to earn hundreds of millions, had evaporated overnight. File on 4 has learnt that the final cost to the taxpayer was £1.4 billion. For Michael Meacher, it's a warning for the future.
It was meant to produce 120 tonnes a year over a 10-year period. So we're talking about 1,200 tonnes in that period. It actually produced, almost unbelievably, 13 tonnes, about 1% of what it was expected to produce. And the costs were much greater than had ever been estimated. To produce 1% of what it was expected to produce, this must be the biggest white elephant in modern times.
And yet the MOX route is the present government's favoured solution to dealing with the plutonium stockpile we've ended up with.
I find it utterly astonishing. I keep on asking to have a serious, objective, independent and transparent analysis of what went wrong the first time, and to ask the obvious question, can we be certain that none of this is going to happen again, that it's not going to be double or treble the original cost, and that it is going to produce what it says it is intended to produce, not just 1%. The important thing is that we don't disregard what has happened.
But despite all the problems, government policy is still to try and turn the plutonium into a usable fuel, and the favoured option remains MOX. Building a new MOX plant will cost a staggering £5 to £6 billion, and following on from the dramatic failure of the old plant, it will be a bitter pill to swallow. This classical building with its carved dolphins over the door slotted away in a side street off Whitehall is the Department of Energy and Climate Change. Now, we wanted to put some of the points raised in this programme to the Minister responsible, Baroness Verma. She was not available for interview. They directed us back to the Nuclear Decommissioning Authority. The NDA's Adrian Simper was one of those who took the decision to close the failing MOX plant. He says lessons have been learned.
The Sellafield MOX plant, which we shut in, I think it was August 2011, following the events in Fukushima and the absence, therefore, of somewhere to send the MOX to, was not a very successful plant. I think that's widely accepted and recognised. We believe we have learnt the lessons of the past, and there is no reason why a future MOX plant should not be very successful.
Details which emerged from WikiLeaks described it as one of the UK's greatest failings in corporate history. That's a disaster rather than just not very effective, isn't it?
A little British understatement on my part. We would not seek to claim that Sellafield MOX plant was great value. It wasn't. It was somewhat emotive language in WikiLeaks, perhaps, but it was not a successful plant and didn't represent good value for BNFL at the time or the taxpayers subsequently.
You can understand why people rightly want to feel that the lessons have been learned. If something goes over budget from 265 million to the final budget of 1.4 billion, that is a huge expense.
Yes.
So have the lessons been learned, so there's no chance of making these mistakes again?
We believe we do understand what went wrong. A project of that complexity, a project of that length of time, is not going to be a success or a failure because of one factor. And if you speak to different people, they will all have their views on what the root causes were and what the lessons to be learnt.
If a new MOX plant is built, the French firm Areva is likely to provide the technology. It has an older, successful MOX factory in France, but more recent projects have been troubled.
A commitment to a safer, more secure tomorrow.
A MOX plant Areva is building for the Americans to get rid of surplus weapons-grade plutonium in South Carolina began confidently.
This facility will be instrumental in permanently removing excess weapons-grade plutonium from the United States nuclear stockpile. And, as an added benefit, this material will be converted into fuel elements to be used in commercial nuclear stations to power homes and businesses in the U.S.
But it's been delayed. It was projected to cost $1 billion. It's expected to come in at 6 or 7 billion, with huge running costs on top. Matthew Bunn, the associate professor at Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government, served US President Bill Clinton in the Office of Science and Technology Policy.
If you look in the U.S. case, for example, when I was in government, we told Congress in good faith that building a mixed oxide fuel plant to turn the plutonium into fuel would cost $1 billion. It's turned out to cost $7 billion is the current estimate. And even the operating cost, if you assume all of that capital cost is sunk, comes to over $200,000 for every kilogram of plutonium we want to get rid of. There's got to be a better way.
For those who've worked in the industry all those years, they will simply say, the plutonium, it's an asset. We just have to find a way of unlocking it. They have a point, don't they?
I don't think they really do. I think they're not looking at the real economics as it exists today. Just because you spent a lot to make something doesn't mean that it's valuable today. If you simply dig up uranium and make that into fuel, it's much cheaper than making plutonium into fuel, even if the plutonium itself is considered free.
So why should British taxpayers be persuaded to fund a new MOX plant when the one in the US went so wildly over budget? I put the figures to Dominic Mockley, the Senior Executive Vice President of Areva, responsible for MOX.
I have not all the features in mind, and
but still, it's gone over cost.
It's the first program in the US, large program that allowed to restart the new construction of the new build in the US. So it's clear that in this type of program you have some difficulties sometimes with the supply chain, etc. But I do not agree with you with the figures.
To 6 billion, that's a huge increase in cost.
Typically, I don't know what was the first cost that was estimated,
well,
and
those
I don't
figures
know
are from the Department of Energy.
Under which condition they were established and what was exactly because sometimes also what is the content of the program may change. So I don't have all these details.
The MOX plant in France seems to work very well from what we can tell from the outside. But it seems that wherever else you try to do it, it doesn't seem to work. Why should we trust taxpayers' money to this?
I cannot follow you what you say. When we take a program and we launch a program and we do it by ourselves, what we deliver is on time and on budget.
But that's not the only problem. Of all the nuclear power stations in Britain, only one at Sizewell in Suffolk is even capable of using MOX fuel, but it hasn't been licensed by regulators to do so, and so it can't. So it would fall to those building new nuclear power stations to use it, but they're reluctant. EDF, the French-owned utility which has the most advanced plans to build new reactors in the UK, has said no to MOX for now. Horizon is a company with plans to build a nuclear power station at Wilver on the Isle of Anglesey. It won't be ready until the mid-2020s. Even then, the Chief Operating Officer, Alan Raymant, says they are reluctant to use MOX.
MOX is clearly one option. There are other options, of course, and that are being discussed as well. But from our point of view, we're focused on developing our projects, getting them operational as soon as possible, and MOX is an option possibly for the longer term.
Not a feature of the discussions that were had, as far as you know?
At this point in time, there are no plans to take MOX through the regulatory process.
And if you were to revisit that decision?
There's no immediate plans to look at using MOX fuel.
So in the absence of a certain market for the fuel, and with doubts and cost overruns emerging in America, why is MOX still the government's preferred scheme for getting rid of the plutonium? The NDA's Adrian Simper says they are aware of the risks. You can see in a time of austerity why taxpayers may well be nervous buying into something which is already hugely expensive, maybe even more expensive still.
Indeed, and that's why in the government's policy position it makes clear that whatever we do is subject to a proper business case, and we will be required to demonstrate that it represents good value for money, that the risks are appropriately transferred into the marketplace where that is possible and have been appropriately taken into account, and also that we've taken into account affordability.
The one thing that's been traditionally put on the plus side for MOX is that you've got some fuel to sell at the end of the day. However, as of now, you don't have anyone to sell it to who's interested, do you?
We don't today, and we don't have any reactors that we could sell it to. And
it's a bit of a problem, isn't it?
I think that's why we're not proposing that we start building a MOX plant this afternoon. It is not a sprint, it is a marathon. We need to make sure we have the right solution at the right time, in the right context. And I think only when new reactors are becoming available and the marketplace has confidence in new nuclear build, will there be the opportunity to have the conversations about the use of MOX fuel.
But we know as of now that none of the present reactors we have are capable of using it, and we've spoken to Horizon about the reactor they're hoping to build on the Isle of Anglesey, and they've said no for the foreseeable future.
Our conversations maybe are slightly different from yours. The utilities are...
What have you been told?
Well, the utilities are saying, in the fullness of time, they would be very pleased to enter into a conversation about whether those reactors could be fuelled with MOX rather than simple uranium fuel.
But they're not signing on the dotted line and saying we'll take it, are they?
No, they're not signing on the dotted line. We're not asking them to sign on the dotted line at this point. It is too early to do that.
Parliament's Energy and Climate Change Committee cross-questioned the Secretary of State on the matter in January. One of the inquisitors was the Conservative MP, Dr. Philip Lee. He is passionately pro-nuclear, but he thinks MOX is a mistake.
My concern is the history of MOX in this country is not a great one. We spent a lot of money. I look abroad to the United States of America and I see a MOX plant being built which is significantly over budget, yet to be completed. And I worry that the approach that we might take is that we may embark upon another nuclear project and it will end up being a bit of a disaster, and we will give the wider nuclear industry a bad name.
Why do you think ministers and experts have been so wedded to the MOX idea?
I have no idea. I mean, I have challenged this. I've asked the question. If there's something I'm not understanding, I'd like to know. All I know is that MOX fuel, there's not a huge demand for it, and the MOX plant we had cost a vast amount of money, and we didn't process very much plutonium in the time that it was running.
Do you think then it's time for the government to change its mind about this?
I've certainly been lobbying for there to be a change of mind, and I'm sort of waiting for this moment when somebody gives me the reason why we are wedded to this belief that MOX is the way forward.
Again, more questions for government ministers. All the technical options the NDA is considering to tackle the problem try to make electricity out of the plutonium. It's a process which leaves you with radioactive waste that has to go somewhere, which raises the question, why not simply declare the plutonium as waste in the first place and prepare it for dumping underground?
There is a view that the plutonium might still have a value in the longer term as an energy source, and it would be unwise of us to give that up. I don't think that argument is terribly credible, but it is made.
Professor Gordon McCarron is the former chairman of the government-appointed Committee on Radioactive Waste Management. In 2006, they recommended the deep underground disposal of all nuclear waste to keep it away from humans for the centuries to come. That became government policy. Now he says it's a solution that could also be used for plutonium.
It's fair to say that at least a major part of the reason why we recommended a repository is that seemed to us to be the best protection to the far distant future generations who will have had no benefit from nuclear power and who might suffer some serious risk of radioactive contamination in the future. But on the other hand, you have to worry about this generation too, and putting material at least a bit underground in the relatively near future helps to protect this generation, which of course has to be balanced against the interests of far future generations. The signal that the UK sends about how it wants to manage the largest civilian plutonium stockpile in the world is very important in proliferation terms. If we were to decide simply to immobilise it and then manage it safely, that sends a much better message to the world, including countries like Iran, about the uses of nuclear materials and putting them beyond the possibility that they might be used in weapons.
It's a policy which has had little attention in the UK so far, but is gaining traction amongst experts in America, including, in a personal capacity, the country's main nuclear regulator. We've also spoken to 3 former White House advisers who support the idea. One of them, Professor Steve Fetter, was Associate Director in the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. He served President Obama until last August. For him, plutonium is waste and should be treated as such.
I think we know that it is possible to dispose of radioactive waste. The U.S. is in fact disposing of defense waste that contains plutonium. So this can be done. The idea would be to put it into a highly stable waste form and to place that waste in a deep borehole in a geologic repository. And I think there is reason to believe that this could be substantially cheaper.
But you can see from the point of view of many in the industry, that's tantamount to sacrilege. You're saying the idea is that this is little better than waste.
If it is in fact cheaper to simply dispose of it as waste, very deep under the ground, than to reuse it as nuclear fuel, then I think that's a perfectly suitable solution.
But the idea of burying plutonium has also received a blow. Nuclear waste dumps are controversial, but when Cumbria County Council voted in January to block plans for an underground repository to hold vast quantities of radioactive waste on the margins of Lakeland, it left government policy in confusion.
From stage 4. All those in favour of withdrawing from stage 4 at the moment, please. Please show. The motion to withdraw is carried. Can I please...
Without a repository scheme, there is no long-term strategy for the waste. A repository would have to hold safely between 5 and 10 Albert halls full of radioactive material for the centuries to come. But for those who want to put the plutonium underground as soon as possible, it is a major headache. A question then for the leader of Cumbria County Council, Eddie Martin. You've set the cat amongst the pigeons today in terms of government policy and a future repository.
In a sense, I hope I have put the cat amongst the pigeons, because there were too many uncertainties for us to walk forward with confidence that we were doing the right thing.
But on the plutonium, many experts, particularly in the United States, have been canvassing for a long time to redesignate it as waste, treat it as such, and put it in the ground in a safe repository.
Well, clearly that's a decision for
the decision you've taken means that plutonium will stay in its most dangerous form for a lot longer on your doorstep.
And we've lived with it for 40, 50, 60 years, and Sellafield has managed it brilliantly. I remain concerned that Cumbria is not the right place. I do think there may well be other parts of the United Kingdom. They've never been explored.
The NDA's Adrian Simper says despite the Cumbrian setback, they have not ruled out the disposal of plutonium as a waste altogether.
We are investigating that option and investing with the National Nuclear Laboratory and others in developing technologies and approaches and understanding what the safety cases would need to dispose of that material. The policy remains intact for higher activity waste, deep geological disposal in England and Wales. The approach to finding a location, managing radioactive waste safely remains intact. And I think it's early yet to have fully digested the decisions that were taken. But I wouldn't at this point be saying, oh, well, then the whole game has changed.
Beginning of the end in terms of persuading rather than forcing communities?
I think you need to talk to the Minister and ask her that question.
Again, we would have liked to have done just that, but the Minister, Baroness Verma, was not available. The government faces an expensive dilemma. Whatever it does to get rid of the plutonium that's been made will cost the country billions. Over the decades, starting with the fast breeder reactor programme, one pricey taxpayer-funded nuclear project has led on to another. The fast breeder reactor programme cost £2.4 billion before it was scrapped. But they kept making the plutonium to fuel the reactors that had gone, and the stockpile grew. They built a MOX factory to deal with plutonium, but it failed. It will now cost £100 million just to decommission safely. Now they're looking at more options, and the NDA's Adrian Simper admits they are all costly. Do you not now feel time to ask questions about this whole chain of industries which has delivered this problem for you to deal with?
Possibly if I was some form of philosophical historian, I may be asking those questions, and I may be searching for a time machine in order to go back and ask them.
But it's a problem that's going to cost you money to solve. Therefore, it's a reasonable question to ask about the decision-making that delivered the material in the first place.
I think it is reasonable to ask the question, but I don't think it's reasonable to wallow in it.
When is the industry going to get a grip of these problems and stop coming to the taxpayer for more money?
Well, as far as the plutonium that we have, that is NDA's job, and that is the exercise we're carrying out now. So when you say to me, when are we going to get a grip? My response is, that is what we are doing. We are getting a grip. The material we have today will cost us money, no matter what we do with it.
The reporter in this week's File in 4 was Rob Broomby, and the programme was produced in Salford by Ian Muir-Cochrane.